evening. Good evening and welcome to this special Prime Ministerial Q&A. My name is Virginia Trioli, here to answer your questions tonight. The Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull. Please welcome our very special guest.
Thank you.
Q&A is live across Australia on ABC TV, iView and News Radio at 9:35 Eastern Daylight Saving Time. And you can stream us around the world on YouTube, Facebook and Periscope. We're everywhere. Now, it's more than 2 years since Malcolm Turnbull successfully challenged for the top job and 18 months since his government was re-elected. It's been a tough political slog for the man that always seemed destined to be Australia's Prime Minister. And the latest headache has been Section 44, the citizenship provisions of the Australian Constitution. And that's the subject of our first question tonight from Esme Fenwick.
I'm too young to vote yet, but I am interested in politics. I have watched the recent dual citizenship fiasco and wondered what all the fuss is about. As a dual citizen myself, I don't feel as though this makes me any less loyal to the country. Australia has always been a nation of immigrants, and nearly everyone has some kind of link to another country. Is the government committed to revising Section 44 of the Constitution to bring it more into line with the modern world?
Well, thanks, Esme. And your example was one of the points we made in our submissions to the High Court, which so spectacularly failed. The reality is that the courts adopted a very literal meaning of Section 44(1), and what they decided was that the section must be read, as I said, very literally. And so even if you didn't know you were a dual citizen, you are still deemed to be disqualified from Parliament. And that's, of course, what happened to Barnaby Joyce and Fiona Nash and quite a few other politicians. Yes, I think the Section 44(1) should be amended, but the term how it should be amended is something that is going to be considered by the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters. But in the meantime, we've got to live with the section as it is and as the High Court has interpreted it. So what we've done is we've made full disclosure of our parents' place of birth, our grandparents' place of birth. Truly, the only creatures in Australia that have more of their pedigree published than Australian politicians now are thoroughbred racehorses. But it's all out there. Now, the people on our side that were dual citizens have all either gone off to the High Court and are no longer in Parliament or have resigned from the Parliament and are contesting re-election. Barnaby Joyce did that and has come back. And, of course, John Alexander is recontesting Bennelong on the weekend. And if everyone from Bennelong that is watching, remember to vote for John Alexander. Australia's champion, Bennelong's champion.
All right, we're going to have to give a shout out to Bill Shorten's candidate there as well, in order, to establish balance here, of course. So we'll mention there's another candidate in Bennelong as well. But let's move along to our next question, and that comes from Andrew Buckhorn.
Yeah.
Last week you announced proposed new espionage laws to deal with foreign influence in Australian politics. The announcement did not follow revelations of Russian influence in American elections or other such events, but only came in the wake of controversy surrounding Labor Senator Sam Dastyari. How do you avoid a perception that the timing may be more about a political football against Labor rather than an intent to resolve a real issue?
Well, the facts are that I wrote to George Brandis back in August last year and asked him to review our laws on foreign interference. Of course, the laws that were introduced into the House last week are, very comprehensive legislation. There have been many, many months in the drafting. So the timing was simply a function of when they were ready to be introduced. Obviously, the Dastyari scandal is very alive at the moment. It is a shocking state of affairs that Bill Shorten is allowing somebody to remain in the Labor Party and in the Senate who quite clearly does not put Australia first. Dastyari is quite plainly been acting in the interests of another government or of another power. It is extraordinary that Bill Shorten, who wants to be Prime Minister of Australia, is failing to put Australia's interest first.
Hang on, just on that, let me just jump in, because in the hunt for so-called Manchurian candidates, Prime Minister, aren't you equally concerned about Australia's security and intelligence organisations potentially leaking against and briefing against elected members of Parliament? Put aside your feelings about Sam Dastyari.
So you're making an allegation there, Virginia?
Well, there's been strong suggestions
There's
been strong suggestions that this has come from somewhere, hasn't it?
Oh, OK.
Yeah.
What? Your allegation has come from somewhere?
There's the information against Sam
Unless
Dastyari.
someone's a ventriloquist, it clearly came from you.
Are you bothered by any sort of leaking from our security? Are you bothered about the potential of that?
I can say to you that the information about Dastyari and his efforts to tip off Mr Wang that he could be being under surveillance from ASIO, and the advice that he gave Mr Wang to put their phones inside so they could not be overheard, that story, if you like, that went to the media did not come from ASIO. So,
some are accusing you. Yeah, sure. Some are accusing you of overreach, though, in this commentary about China. Particularly, I mean, you mentioned the Seat of Bennelong before, and you've got a very high Chinese population there. I can tell you that a number of questions in our audience tonight that we couldn't get to because we had so many. A number of questions coming from Chinese or Chinese origin members of the community were enormously concerned about plays to prejudice or dog whistling in a lot of that commentary that you made at the weekend while you were there.
Well,
do you want to rethink any of that?
Well, let me just say, the suggestion that I or my government or Australia generally is anti-Chinese is outrageous. Absolutely outrageous. Every country is entitled to defend its national interest. And Australians, whether they are of Chinese background or not, expect their leaders to stand up for Australia. There are 1 million Australians of Chinese ancestry, 1 million. Well, you could not imagine modern Australia, the most successful multicultural society in the world, without them. And among those 1 million Australians with Chinese ancestry is our granddaughter. So the proposition that someone whose granddaughter calls him yeah is anti-Chinese is absurd, completely absurd. This is a question about our national interest and ensuring that our leaders, our senators, our members of the House put Australia first. And Bill Shorten has failed that test by standing up for Australia and chucking Dastyari out of the Labor Party and out of the Senate.
I think we have a comment here that I just wanted to go to if we possibly can. I think it possibly relates to where we are. Go ahead.
I just wanted to say I think you're sort of salivating a little bit too much, especially when you sort of put this issue beside WA, Liberal Party and Julie Bishop, who's the Foreign Minister, accepted in, I think, the 13-14 financial year, accepted more than $500,000 from, I think, largely groups associated with Mr Huan. And Julie Bishop, who's also the Foreign Minister, went on to sing Mr Huan's praises in public on 3 separate occasions. So you seem to be making a big deal about Mr Dastyari, but what about in the context of Julie Bishop, who has more senior responsibilities in the federal government, Foreign Minister? Why aren't you making a big deal about that?
OK, we'll just get a quick comment and we'll move on to another question.
Well, I expect Australian senators to support the work of ASIO in keeping Australia safe, not undermine it. It's that simple.
You don't want to go to the particular issue there about Julie Bishop and
well, what is the issue? Well, I mean, the gentleman has made some claims about Julie Bishop. Can I tell you, Australia has never had a finer foreign minister than Julie Bishop. She stands up for Australia right around the world, and every time Australians see her representing Australia, they are proud. She would never sell our country's interests down the river for having some personal loans paid off, like Senator Dastyari did. Let's just be clear about what Senator Dastyari did. Hang on. The gentleman raised the matter. The gentleman raised the matter. He wants a response.
We've had that question asked and answered. So
we're not allowed to talk about Senator Dastyari anymore.
I think we have spoken about Senator Dastyari.
He's the senator whose name may no longer be mentioned.
I think it's been mentioned more than once on this evening, Prime Minister.
OK. All right. Very good.
We have a lot of questions to get to, is the issue. And we'll go to one now from Olivia Morris.
Good evening, Prime Minister Turnbull. I voted for you in my first ever election.
Good.
With the hope...
Good. Please, I encourage you to make a habit of it.
With the hope that many of your personal beliefs were far more progressive and idealistic than the policy line that the coalition has adopted since you became Prime Minister. Since opinion polls suggest that the coalition will be hard-pressed to win the next election, why not go down in flames rather than continuing to bow to the factional right? Is party unity more important to you than your personal legacy as PM?
Well, thanks for the question. I'm not sure how you reconcile that with the legalisation of same-sex marriage last week. That was an issue that when I used to come onto the show in the past, that was always raised with me, Virginia. People said, Malcolm, you agree that same-sex marriage should be legalised, but you haven't got around to it or it hasn't been done. You know what? It's the law. I delivered exactly what I promised. At the election, you voted for me on the last occasion. What did I say on same-sex marriage? I said, we'll give everybody their say. Who tried to stop me doing that? The Labor Party. They did everything they could. They did not want Australians to have their say. We gave them their say. They voted in gigantic numbers. Extraordinary turnout in a voluntary postal vote.
So we've got that one sorted, so now the voters have other ideas for you.
62% voted yes, and now it's the law. I did exactly what I promised at the election, and same-sex marriage has been legalised.
Can I return you to the question? The question is party unity more important to you than your personal legacy as Prime Minister? Because Olivia is suggesting there are a number of issues, and we can go back to you to expand on that if you like, Olivia, that clearly you see as Malcolm Turnbull has not lived up to. Is that what you're saying?
Well, it's not the Malcolm Turnbull that I grew up with.
Well, Olivia, tell me how I've disappointed.
Well, just with the plebiscite, for example, that plebiscite was Tony Abbott's idea, as I understand it. We live in a representative democracy. Why take that to a plebiscite? You can represent us and just change that immediately without wasting 126 million.
Olivia, OK. Olivia, let me ask you this. Do you think politicians should keep their promises?
Yes.
Right. Did I promise to give everyone their say? I did. So I kept my promise. So you should approve of it.
The question takes you to, I guess, the persistent and undermining nature of the Conservative rump, if you like, in your party, and how difficult that's been for you.
If I had just lost attention for a minute and forgotten I was at the ABC, that question would have brought me right back to where I was.
I don't think the Conservatives in your party are a figment of the imagination of the ABC.
Oh, no, but, I'm sure, well,
and that seems to be a key part of what you have to deal with.
Well, it's a broad church.
Can I just take you back to the question, if I may? The question was about your legacy.
My legacy?
Yes. And whether trying to appease, trying to appease people, Livy's up there.
That's
whether
right.
trying to appease
That's right.
complainants in your party is difficult to reconcile with an idea of legacy. Do you have an idea of what your legacy should be?
It's a subject I'll turn my mind to when I start writing my memoirs, which is going to be many years in the future. Seriously. I mean, this is not about... My job is not about me. It is about 25 million Australians. It's about ensuring that they have great opportunities to get ahead, to get a job, to get a better job, to start a business. It's about ensuring that there's more money in the pockets of hard-working Australian businesses and families. It's ensuring that they live in a fair society where everyone has a fair go. It's ensuring that they are safe from threats, whether it is terrorism or foreign interference or the many other threats that we face. So my job is not about me, it's about our fellow Australians. And so, commentators, journalists, whatever, can write about me and comment on me and as much as they like, but my focus is on the people I serve, 25 million Australians.
I think that's what Olivia's question went to, which was trying to get a sense of the person that she voted for. But I think a question does arise from that, Olivia, about the who the Prime Minister is trying to appease in his party in order to be truly himself and represent some kind of legacy. And I wanted to ask you, Prime Minister, on the back of the same-sex marriage vote and the fact that has been such a roaring and celebrated success, Tony Abbott, of course, has dogged you at every step. Do you think this puts this to one side? Does that put his power, does it diminish his power and place him away from you and remove him from dogging you at every step?
Well, I mean, Tony's the member for Warringah. He's a member in the party room. He's entitled to express his views. I get on with the job of delivering on my commitments. You know,
Has this diminished his power or his authority to bother you?
Well, I am unbothered.
All right, let's go to our next question. It comes from Yelena Yabutseva. Go ahead.
My question to Malcolm Turnbull is on Australian identity. Prime Minister, how would you define core elements of Australian identity? What unites us? What distinguishes us from the rest of the world? What makes Australians Australian? And I'm interested in this question from professional expertise point of view and also as a relatively new Australian citizen myself.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Yelena. Look, we define our identity, our national identity, not by reference to race or ethnicity or religion, as so many other countries do. We define it by reference to shared political values that are accessible to everyone, whether you or your family have come from Russia, whether from China, or wherever in the world. You know, we are the most successful multicultural society in the world. Our values are available to everyone because they're thoroughly democratic. Democracy, the rule of law, equality, mutual respect, a fair go. Now, you know, the mix of them in Australia is unique. The mix is unique. The values, each and every one of them, is not unique, but the mix of them in Australia is unique. And we should never, ever forget that we are the most successful multicultural society in the world. Do you know we have a much higher percentage of our population born outside of Australia than there are Americans born outside of America, and America regards itself as the great melting pot of, you know, multicultural melting pot. We are much more so than America, and we have been much more successful, and it's because of mutual respect and those values.
Yelena, do you believe they're the core values? Are they the ones that you reflect on when you think about
I highly respect those elements that you've underlined, Prime Minister. But what distinguishes us then from the rest of the world? The democratic principles, the respect towards each other, this cosmopolitan values are remarkable. But what makes then us unique?
Well, I just said that those values are, the mix of them in Australia is unique. They're obviously, you know, you could look to a country like New Zealand, it's very similar. But I would think that many of the European countries that would regard themselves as, you know, and that are clearly democracies, there isn't the same sense of inclusion, there isn't the same sense of mutual respect. I mean, I'd ask yourself this question. If you, for example, were living in Germany, and you were say you were a second or third generation person of Turkish origin, and there are many people that fit that description in Germany, would you feel as German as a person also of Turkish origin of that long standing in Australia would feel Australian? I think the answer, we all know, is clearly not. So we have got a remarkably successful multicultural society, and I believe that this is based on those values, fair go, mutual respect being vitally important. We have a very strong live and let live approach to life, and we respect each other, and that is the key to our harmony, and that is why, as your Prime Minister, I talk about it quite a lot.
Like other countries and democracies in particular, do you think or fear that we're starting to head down the path of there being competing identities and very separate identities within this country, that over time might be difficult to bring together in the way that we have in the past.
Can you give me some examples?
Yeah, I think maybe, for example, a party like One Nation and Pauline Hanson would think that they had an understanding of a particular kind of Australian identity. The Greens would feel the same. Our artists and our writers have a very different understanding and apprehension of identity as well. And I wonder whether they all come together as well and as harmoniously as they once did.
Well, I actually think we are more diverse and more multicultural now than we've ever been. And I think the degree of harmony in which we live is remarkable. And if you look around the world, and we should all do that a little bit more often just to remind ourselves of what the alternatives look like, we do live in a remarkable degree of harmony, and it is because of mutual respect. And as I said, those values which do not differentiate between people, on the basis of their race, religion, colour of their skin, their cultural background and so forth. That is the genius of the great Australian project. Our nation is so successful as a multicultural society. It is the envy of the world. And we should be very proud of it and we should cherish it.
Just very quickly before we move on to our next question, I did want to ask on that because I know that once upon a time a key sense for you and for many others of this country becoming what it should be was to ultimately at some point become a republic. Is that still uppermost in your mind, particularly following the success of the same-sex marriage debate? Is that something you would return to in your time as Prime Minister?
Well, it depends, Virginia. I took the view... back after the 99 referendum, which sadly was not successful. You remember I led the case, for the younger members of the audience, I led the case for the Yes campaign then. I took the view that the next opportunity where it could be successful was likely to be after the end of the Queen's reign.
You still believe that?
I haven't been persuaded to the contrary view. Yeah, I'm still of that view. Constitutional change in Australia is very hard. And coming back to Esme's question about Section 44, that is, Esme, that's the big challenge is firstly deciding on how you would change that section, and secondly, an even bigger challenge is how you would amend it. So you would, constitutional change is not for the faint-hearted, and we've had 46 proposed amendments to the Constitution since the Commonwealth was founded, and my recollection is only 8 have been successful. So it is a very hard slog, and the last controversial one that was successful was in 1946. So you've got to make sure you've got the timing right, and I think the timing for another vote on the Republic is after the end of the Queen's reign, which will be an extraordinary time of sadness and also an extraordinary watershed in world history.
You're watching a very special Prime Ministerial question time tonight on Q&A, and our next question comes from Michael Doyle.
Good evening, Prime Minister.
Hi, Michael.
Hi. The Uluru Statement from the Heart was a bipartisan approach, came out of a bipartisan approach to consult Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians on constitutional recognition. After a really extensive consultation, the whole process seemed to be knocked over by you and the Cabinet. I wondered what to ask you at this point, and really I guess the question is, where are we going to go now, Prime Minister? How are you going to lead us as a nation through the next stages of this process?
OK, well, thanks, Michael. The referendum or recognition process, as you know, had been heading down for many years down the process of making some amendments to the Constitution to, ensure that the power to legislate, for example, to legislate with respect to First Australians could only be done for the advancement of First Australians, for there to be recognition of First Australians in the Constitution, and other matters like that. And then what happened with the Uluru Statement, as you know, was a proposition that there should be in the Constitution a national elected representative assembly, which would be an advisory assembly to the Parliament. This is called the Voice. Now, I don't think, and the Cabinet doesn't think, that that is a good idea. Let me tell you why. Our representative institutions are based on the proposition that all Australians are equal and that every Australian citizen, whether they are a first Australian or whether they were, naturalised last week, is entitled to stand for and vote for, of course, and be elected to. And, of course, there are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voices in the Parliament now. I mean, my colleague Ken Wyatt, the member for Hasluck, as you know, is the first Aboriginal to be a minister in an Australian government. I appointed him, and he is an outstanding minister. He was the first Aboriginal man to be elected to the House of Representatives, and sitting opposite him on the Labor side is Linda Burney, the first Aboriginal woman. Now, these are all voices in the Parliament. An assembly of the kind that is proposed would be, in effect, a third chamber of Parliament. And I don't believe our Parliament should have any chambers other than the two that it does, the House and the Senate, and they are open to all Australians.
Michael, did you want to jump in?
Well, I do. I'm not debating your decision about that particular aspect. What I'm asking you tonight, sir, is that what are we going to do next? You've said no to that.
Yeah, right.
OK, let's put that to one side.
Well, I'll tell you what we should do.
What are we going to do next? What's going to happen in 6 months' time? What are we going to be talking about at this time next year? Will we have progressed on this issue? Or are we going to have
I
the
hope
same
so.
conversation?
I mean, I understand very keenly what was behind the Uluru Declaration and the call to have more of a say for recognition in every respect. Now, in terms of process, what we are doing, we're discussing the terms of reference with the opposition at the moment because I do want it to be bipartisan, is a joint committee of the Parliament to consider all of the recommendations that have been made on this subject of recognition of First Australians, and there are many. The Uluru Declaration is one of many, and to consider them all and then present, as the work of the Parliament, the options that we can pursue to go forward. But it's very important for me, as I said this at Garma, to give the recommendations from Uluru the respect that they deserve, to reflect on them deeply and sincerely, and then give an honest answer rather than, sort of try to push the issue out into the long grass. It's very important to speak the truth and say what you honestly feel. I do not believe what would in effect be a third chamber of Parliament available only to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people is consistent with our constitutional values.
Mark, I'll just leave it there. We have another question that I do want to go to on this, but just before we go to that question, Prime Minister, you'll be well aware, as many others will be, amongst others, that Noel Pearson said that, in his view, it does not create that third chamber of Parliament at all.
Well, with respect to Noel, I disagree. If you set up a chamber, an assembly, and you put it in the Constitution, and you say that it is there to advise the Parliament on legislation, then inevitably every piece of legislation will have to go through.
Well, let me go to Teela Reid, because I think Teela has a question on this. Yeah. Teela Reid.
Prime Minister, with respect to what you say about the voice to Parliament, I was part of the constitutional dialogue process. Yep. You gave Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people the space to tell you what we thought meaningful recognition was. We rejected symbolism, and we reached a national consensus for a representative First Nations voice to advise Parliament on the issues that affect our lives. Not a third chamber, and not an advisory council handpicked by you, and not even those MPs that are in Parliament currently.
Well, what's wrong
why
with
why won't you respect our proposal to take it to a referendum and put it to the people like you put the marriage equality to the people? Because polls reveal up to 61% of Australians are in support of this proposal.
Well, Well, I can tell you it would be a third. It would be effectively be a third chamber. And let me explain why. If you set up, say you have this assembly, it's elected by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, how that mode of election is going to be truly representative. There's plenty of issues to work out there, but let's say that was worked out. And it's to advise the Parliament on laws that affect Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Do you know what that means? That means every law affects Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Every single law that goes through the Parliament, whether it's tax, whether it's defence, whether it's social security, whether it's health, they all affect Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people because they're part of the Australian community. And that would mean that that assembly would have the right, if it chose, to examine every piece of legislation. It would be, in effect, a third chamber. Now, as to its prospects at a referendum, let me tell you, I honestly, as someone who's had some experience in how easy it is to change the Australian Constitution, it would have no prospect of success whatsoever. And I can tell you that is the view of every Member of Parliament that I've discussed this with. And I know there are some who want to kid it along and just, you know, literally, well, they're basically mislead. People that don't tell you the truth are misleading you. What I'm telling you is the truth, is what I believe, and what I'm very, what I have to be honest with you about this. I don't think it's a good idea, and if it were put up in a referendum, it would go down in flames.
I want to go back to Teela.
That's my view.
We hear that's your view. Teela, do you believe there's some way this would work and not end up being this alternative chamber, as the Prime Minister says?
I think the Prime Minister continues to undermine our democracy, and clearly the point of the Uluru Statement was that we put the voice to Parliament and the makeup of that voice to Parliament in the Parliament's hands. The Prime Minister can honestly not sit there and say it will fail. If that's his position, then we clearly need a leader with some courage who's going to take our country entirely, not just Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but everyone. He's continuously said tonight that this is about mutual respect. In his dismissal of the Uluru Statement, clearly showed no respect to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who participated in those significant dialogues when you look at comparative democracies around the world that have a lot more in their democratic process for the First Nations people. It's been really disheartening to see his dismissal of this.
All right. Well, you might just leave that as a comment.
Well, Teela, let me add one final point. I'm disappointed that you place so little store on the Aboriginal people, members of the Australian Parliament. I was at, well...
It's because they represent their political interests.
Oh.
All right.
Really? So Ken Wyatt, what are you saying about Ken Wyatt and Linda Burney?
I totally
they're
respect their positions in Parliament, but they've both got political positions to make in Parliament. They don't represent the interest of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And who here can honestly sit and say that we have a fair go in the political life of our people? We were from the get-go dismissed from the Constitution entirely. So I really think you're misconceiving this idea.
You now have Aboriginal people in the Parliament, elected to the Parliament, serving there with their fellow Australians. I look forward to there being many more, and to dismiss them as just being, you know, what are you suggesting? They are tokens of
Absolutely
political parties?
not what I'm saying
at all. Please, can I just say this?
We don't have to leave this section.
No, hang on. I think it's very important tonight that we respect the Aboriginal members of the House and the Senate. They are there, proud Australians, proud First Australians, and they are there, powerful voices with 60,000 years of history in our Parliament, and I respect them, and I think all Australians should too.
As do I.
All right. Thanks for that, and we'll leave that there. Our next question now comes from Yvonne Porter.
Hi, good evening, Prime Minister in Virginia. I'll just say that I'm a manager of a service water place that represents Forgotten Australians, people impacted by forced adoption and the Royal Commission. So my question goes a little bit to what you said earlier about being a leader who stands up for all Australians. So the Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sexual abuse hands its report to government this Friday on the 15th. Can you, as leader of the government, make commitment and seek bipartisan support to uphold all of the recommendations that the Royal Commission releases?
Well, clearly we'll read all the recommendations first. I think you'd expect me to do that, but it has done a remarkable work, and I want to say thank you to the commissioners and their staff, but above all, thank you to the courageous Australians, forgotten Australians and survivors of child sexual abuse who gave evidence and told harrowing stories to the Royal Commission. I want to thank them and honour them. We should all do that. They've been very, very brave. We have already set out our plan for a national redress scheme, which we're seeking support from across the aisle, from a bipartisan point of view, and from the states. So we're well advanced in dealing with the recommendations that the Royal Commission has already flagged in their interim report.
Our next question now comes from Jacob Sukenik.
Recently, Donald Trump announced that the United States would recognise Jerusalem as the official capital of Israel. Considering the currently divisive nature of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the mixed reactions from Australians, do you believe that this move serves as a detriment to further peace processes? Or is there still hope for a diplomatic response to promote a peaceful and stable environment in the Middle East?
Well, dealing with the end of your question first, yes, there is always hope. I was in Israel and the Palestinian territories very recently and spent time with the Israeli Prime Minister and indeed with the Palestinian Prime Minister. Look, the differences are enormous, but I believe that with goodwill and a determination to come to a resolution, agreement can be reached. But, it has eluded everybody for a long time. In terms of the decision to move the US Embassy, I won't comment on the impact of the US decision, but Australia's embassy will remain in Tel Aviv.
Does the move by the US Embassy in some way, though, despite what we would like to do, have some effect on us and therefore have some effect on the success of a future peace process?
Well, it doesn't have any effect on us in terms of what we will do. Our policy position remains precisely where it has been for many years. In terms of its effect on the peace process, time will tell. I mean, you've got to remember that Donald Trump promised to do this during his election campaign. There has been an act of the US Congress for well over 20 years stating that the US Embassy should move to Jerusalem, and presidents have had a power every 6 months to effectively postpone, putting that into operation. Trump campaigned with a pledge to stop doing that and to let the force of the act, that 20-odd-year-old act, go into effect, and he's delivered on his promise. So it shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone. That his decision, I mean.
I think we have a comment or a question just here. It's on the subject that we're on. Yes, go right ahead. Yep.
Mr. Prime Minister, I think you are the first Prime Minister to invite an Israeli Prime Minister to Australia. So in this regard, are you advising or are you saying anything to Mr. Donald Trump? Because he's obviously he's doing things, anti-Muslim things. Just to mention, not about Jerusalem, he tweeted a racist video that was in England, and he tweeted that he uploaded that video actually, and that was condemned by British politicians and even Mrs. Theresa May. She reacted strongly about it. So, Mr. Donald Trump, about Jerusalem, about anti-Muslim rhetoric. So, as an ally, I understand Australia is a good friend of America. So, Mr. Prime Minister, can you advise or can you make any comment to Donald Trump, or are we afraid of him, please?
Well, I have a very good relationship with President Trump, and we have discussed the Middle East. I've discussed I do. I've discussed the the Middle East peace process with him, in fact, very recently when we last met in Manila. So yes, I have discussed it with him, and I guess that answers the question. And I mean, as far as racism is concerned, as you know, I have zero tolerance for racism, absolutely zero tolerance for racism. It is fundamental to our success as the most successful multicultural society in the world that we respect each other, and that means zero tolerance for racism.
All right, we are watching a very special Prime Ministerial Q&A tonight, and our next question is a video question, and it comes from Robert McBride from Talano Station, Lower Darling, New South Wales.
Never in Australian history has the river system been collapsing like it is at the moment. There is theft and corruption running this river system. Ken Matthews did a wonderful job in New South Wales, but we do need a federal Royal Commission. So, to the Prime Minister, I would ask, when does the Royal Commission start? Please, South Australia's not playing games. This is the destruction of the most amazing river system on the planet.
A Royal Commission into the theft of water from the river system, Prime Minister?
Yeah, well, thank you. Thanks, Robert. And I can see that looks like a pretty dry riverbed behind him too. So the problems with water theft in New South Wales have been examined very carefully now by a number of inquiries and reviews, including one whose results I released just a week or so ago by the Murray-Darling Basin Authority. It's quite clear what the problems are. Among them, they are a failure to keep proper records, a failure to ensure there is proper compliance with water regulations. So essentially, the answers have all been set out. The water rules are there. They have to be complied with. I say just have to be complied with. It's obviously easier said than done. So I have had some experience in creating Royal Commissions, particularly recently, and all I can say in terms of the water theft issue in New South Wales, I think it has been very thoroughly investigated, and what we have to do now is make sure that people take no more water from the system than they are licensed to do so.
Is part of the problem that the authority that also was one of the reviews that looked into the system has part of their role is compliance, and so it's always going to be difficult for them to sort of sit above it, if you like, and independently review. I guess that goes to his question about whether you need to take it outside the system and have some broader review.
Well, I was responsible as John Howard's Water Minister, you may remember, for introducing the Commonwealth Water Act, which was for the first time put the regulation of the Murray-Darling Basin's waters under federal jurisdiction. Now, that federal jurisdiction was diluted somewhat by the Rudd government when they came in at the end of that year. But nonetheless, those big water reforms are ones I'm very familiar with, and obviously I had a major hand in them.
But to answer this question, no Royal Commission for this one?
Well, I don't believe it would have any merit. I don't think it'd add any value, Virginia. I mean, you've got to remember, Royal Commissions are inquiries. They can ask questions, subpoena documents, hear, people giving evidence. But at the end of the day, all they can do is write a report. Now, very important reports too, and they make recommendations to government and others. I believe in the case of the water theft in New South Wales, the investigations have been conducted, a number of them. The information is there, and now the job is making sure that the rules are complied with, and that's what I believe the governments, New South Wales in particular, and the federal government, our agencies, will ensure happens.
We have another question now, and it comes from Thomasina Owens.
Good evening. I have 3 members of my family who have a significant disability. I'm extremely grateful for the services the NDIS brings. The thing I find most traumatic is that every 6 months I must provide evidence that my severely disabled brother's circumstances remain the same. My brother was born with an intellectual disability. He cannot be left unsupervised, and he cannot communicate. I was speechless and felt physically sick, Prime Minister, when I was asked what value for money my brother's NDIS funding will bring should it be approved. My question to you is, do you think it is appropriate for people with an intellectual disability to be made to jump through hoops regularly to prove their worth for basic services when they have limited or no capacity to understand this scheme?
Well, Thomasina, thank you for that question, and I just want to say thank you to you for showing so much love and care to your family, and in particular to your brother. So I just want to thank you for that. Now, in terms of the reporting arrangements, the NDIS is a gigantic project, a gigantic national project. It's rolling out at great pace. You know, when it's fully rolled out by 2020, over the next few years, it'll have 460,000 Australians being supported in one way or another. And in terms of what your family has encountered with it, perhaps what I should do is get the details of your particular case and follow it up. I mean, this is a great national exercise in compassion and love. It is an extraordinary project. There are thousands, there will be hundreds of thousands of people being helped that were not helped before. There's a lot of innovation in this, and inevitably there will be issues with, teething problems, if you like, as the scheme is rolled out. But I can assure you that perhaps if we can deal with your particular case is the best way to handle it.
Thomasina, I mean, particularly you would like that provision where this has to be reviewed again and again for something that clearly won't change.
Yes.
You'd like that looked at?
Yes, my father is ageing and he is terrified. He can't enjoy his retirement because every 6 months our funding is reviewed and we are made aware that the scheme is blowing out and our needs are causing it to blow out, and it's just so awful.
Well, and this is why, Thomasina, you raise a very good point here. The scheme is a very expensive one. There's no doubt about that. The Labor Party did not fully fund it. There's also no doubt about that. Now, what we hoped to be able to do was to fund it by making savings elsewhere, but we couldn't get them through the Senate. That's just a fact of political life. And so that's why we're seeking to increase the Medicare levy by 50 basis points, by 0.5%. That will fully fund the NDIS. And what that will mean is that your father will know that your brother will always have the NDIS funds available for him. So if you're speaking to any crossbenchers or Labor members in the Senate, please encourage them to support the increase in the Medicare levy.
Thomasina, we'll have to leave. Thank you for your question, and maybe we'll get an answer one day on the actual provisions and the hoops that some of these people have to go through in order to keep qualifying for their funding. We have a web question now next from Bill Edge. This comes from Airlie Beach in Queensland, and the question is, could you explain, Prime Minister, why you are allowing approximately 200,000 people to immigrate to this country every year, and are there any plans to limit this intake, or will it go on ad infinitum? What is the purpose of this massive intake, which is well above other countries?
Well, thank you for the question. Our immigration program is overwhelmingly skills-based, so it is driven by the demands in our economy. So as you get, as you have more demand for people with the skills that we need in our economy, then you'll get more immigration. If you have less slower economic growth, you'll get less immigration. We've taken steps, as you know, to abolish the rorts in the 457 visa class, the temporary migration visa class, and so we're very focused on making sure that we don't bring in skills from overseas unless there really is a skills shortage in Australia. But the answer to the question is that we need the people that come to Australia overwhelmingly are in response to demands from the economy. Obviously, there are also, people who get married overseas and come in. There are family reunion categories as well, and of course the humanitarian program. But overwhelmingly, the immigration program is driven by our economy, and I have to say is admired around the world. I'm not sure how popular Donald Trump is in this audience tonight, but he has been heard to speak very positively about our skills-based migration program, as indeed have many other countries' leaders.
Let's go to our next question now. It comes from Yasser Nasseri.
As someone who fled Iran, being one of 47 survivors from a boat that sank with 250 people, I would like to know why you think it is acceptable to ignore the UN Convention for Refugees, which Australia signed, which states that people escaping persecution have the right to come to Australia any way they can, including by boat, to seek asylum. So why do you think it is acceptable that men like me, like myself, who fled terror, be locked away in Manus Island, tortured, abused and neglected? How can you stand by and say we are a nation that gives a fair go when this is how you treat vulnerable people?
Well, Yasser, you nearly drowned, didn't you, coming here? Yeah. If there were 1,200 people who drowned during Labor's time in government because they came with people smugglers, like you did, on boats. Right. 50,000 people got here without any authority. The Labor Party outsourced the control of our borders to people smugglers, to criminals. You signed up with a criminal, a people smuggler, to get yourself to Australia, and you nearly lost your life. And the reality is this, that if we allowed the people on Manus to come to Australia, the boats would start up again. Criminals like the one whose conduct drowned 3/4 of the people on your boat. Thank God you survived, but so many others did not. I want to keep Australians safe. I want to keep Australia's borders secure. I don't want people to drown again at sea on people smugglers' boats. So what we have is one of the most generous humanitarian programs in the world. We take nearly 20,000 refugees a year. But you know what? We choose them. We decide which refugees come to Australia. I am not going to do what Labor did and abandon the security of our borders, see thousands of people drowning at sea, outsource the protection of our country to criminal gangs. We are a generous, compassionate nation, but the refugees that come here are chosen by Australia, not by people smugglers. That is Australian sovereignty.
Yes, sir. Can I ask you why you got on that boat? I mean,
escaping persecution.
Yes, but you got on that boat, and I guess you're part of this people smuggling model that we hear both sides of government now, both sides of Parliament, say that they are committed to breaking. So does that give you any pause when you reflect on that?
The problem is when you are asylum seekers, and you're on a run, you're fleeing your country and you want somewhere safe, and there is no option except taking the boat. And I don't see the point that I understand what Prime Minister is saying, but it doesn't justify torturing people and kids in Manus Island.
Well, Yasser, nobody is tortured on Manus, and there are no children there.
But the video showed that it's...
Well, you just said there are kids there. There are no kids there at all. They're all males.
But their family...
They're all adult males.
There have been kids.
No, not on Manus. No, they're all adult males.
Manus and Nauru
as part of that entire system.
Let me just say this. Kevin Rudd and the Labor Party put the people on Nauru and Manus. My government is getting them off. I did a deal with President Obama for the US to take up to 1,250 refugees from Nauru and Manus. I was able to maintain that deal with President Trump, you may recall. That program is underway. 54 have already gone. and we expect others to follow. But if we bring them to Australia, you know as well as I do, Yasser, that the people smugglers will be there. They'll be there on Twitter, they'll be there on WhatsApp, they'll be there on Facebook, they'll be marketing, they'll be saying, business, the door is open again. The Australians have lost their nerve, they've lost their will to defend their borders, hop on the boats, they'll be taking money off people like yourself, going to sea in boats, and you know what? Many of them will drown because not all of them will survive the sinking of boats like you did. And again, we thank God that you survived.
Yes,
what about the ones that drowned?
I'll give you one brief last word.
Sure, I see the point, but I have two very major points, which is why you don't accept New Zealand deal, and second, if you stop both, why you stop UNHCR process as well from Jakarta?
Just very quickly on the New Zealand deal, maybe a response to that, because New Zealand is offering a way out of this, and it would seem the government's reluctant to take it up.
Well, New Zealand, OK. Let me give you a few facts about New Zealand. New Zealand, since the Second World War, has taken 33,000 refugees. We've taken more than that in the last 2 years.
Let's just stick with this issue here. They're offering to take the people from Manus, and it solves that problem. So why stand in the way of that deal?
We have about 1,600 people between Nauru and Manus who have refugee status. If 150 went to New Zealand, that is all New Zealand has ever offered to take, 150, that would be used by the people smugglers as marketing, and it would be used as essentially a backdoor to Australia. The advantage of the American deal is that it is clearly a one-off, right? It does not apply to people who come subsequently. And I think even the people smugglers and their would-be customers understand that when America says it's a one-off and it won't happen again, and we say it's a one-off and it won't happen again, they believe us. We have to... Yasser, I sympathise with you and I sympathise with the tragic experience you had. But I'm the Prime Minister of Australia. My job is to defend Australia's borders and defend the integrity of our nation and our sovereignty. And that means we decide which refugees come to Australia. We are very generous. We take a very large number of refugees. We take over 18,000 refugees a year. And, of course, in the last 2 years, we've also been taking additional refugees from the Syrian conflict zone.
We have to move on, Prime Minister, because we're short of time, but thank you, and Yasser, thank you for your questions on that as well. Our next question tonight comes from Aldo Donato.
Mr Prime Minister, you apparently saved us billions of dollars when you, as Communications Minister, convinced us that we only needed a basic NBN. 5 years later, NBN costs have almost doubled, and the NBN has paused the rollout of its hybrid coaxial fibre technology because the number of complaints are astronomical and the technology does not work. At what point do we acknowledge that the cost savings do not justify the incredibly poor service and accept the need to revert to a fibre-to-the-house solution that an innovation nation deserves?
Well, thanks, Aldo. Almost everything you said there is incorrect. I'll just go through it. The cost of the NBN has not doubled. The fact of the matter is that if we were to do an NBN on fibre to the premises across the nation, as you know, it would take 6 to 8 years longer and cost up to $30 billion more. That is a fact, Aldo. I'm sorry, that really is a fact. As far as the NBN is concerned, it is now available at 6.5 million premises. It has 3.3 million paying customers. It will be 3/4 built by the 30th of June next year, according to the company's plans, and they say they're on track to that, and they are committed to getting it completed by 2020. The pause in the HFC rollout is in order to ensure that premises that are on hybrid fibre coax, these are people with effectively mostly Foxtel pay TV cables, they continue to get their broadband service from Telstra, and they won't be switched over to the NBN until some technical issues have been resolved. The pause in the rollout is about 6 months. And Aldo has his hand up. So there you go.
I'm not arguing with the points that you've made are technically correct. It is a faster rollout.
But they're technically correct, but in what respect are they wrong if they're technically correct?
Well, the point that I'm getting at is
technically mean factually correct?
Okay, yes, they are factually correct.
That's good.
But
that's good.
But what you sold to us was at the last election an innovative nation. That's what we want to be.
Sure.
And I don't feel that the NBN that you are rolling out is giving us the potential to be the best that we can be.
Well, Aldo,
we're rolling out a faster NBN, but it's a far superior NBN, a far inferior NBN.
No, well, you're wrong. With great respect, Aldo, you're quite wrong. It is rolling out faster, and that means that more people are getting high-speed broadband more quickly. Believe me, the technology that you have to connect you to the internet is much less important, is irrelevant compared to the service level. What you want to do is what you need to have is the right service level to meet your needs. And what we are doing is ensuring that more people get connected more quickly and at prices they can afford. And, you know, do you remember the debate we used to have a few years back when they said everyone's going to need 1,000 megabits per second speed? Do you remember that? Everyone, you would be you would just be a total loser, they said, if you don't have 1,000 megabits per second speed. The vast majority of customers on the NBN pay for products of 25 megabits per second or less.
Is that your phone ringing there, Malcolm Turnbull?
Who knows? Who knows?
Every single time we talk about this subject. But look,
but seriously, Aldo, it is the approach that we're taking is consistent with the approach that is happening right around the world. In other words, you focus on the customer and making sure the customer gets the right service as quickly as possible and at the lowest possible cost. That's the goal.
I don't think you're listening to the customer, because most people that I talk to who have had the NBN connected are all complaining about incredibly slow services.
Well, we saw the refunds that are going to have to be made today by Optus because it can't do what people thought it would be able to.
Because you've had, you know, frankly, the retail service providers. Remember, NBN's a wholesaler, okay? So it doesn't actually have a relationship with the customers, you know, with retail customers. But some of the retailers like Telstra and Optus and others have been misrepresenting their products, and that's where they've been caught out, and they're having to properly describe them. And that's good.
All right, let's move on to our next question, which comes from Brian Marnie.
Prime Minister, as a grandfather, I'm deeply concerned about what kind of future our grandchildren will have in an ever-warming world caused by fossil fuel burning. Prime Minister, in 2010, you said, "We are, as humans, conducting a massive science experiment with this planet. It's the only planet we've got. The consequences of unchecked global warming would be catastrophic." How can you justify support for new coal mines like Adani, or a new coal-fired generator, as proposed by Senator Canavan in Queensland, or coal seam gas fracking in the Pilliga by Santos? How can you now justify and support these fossil fuel projects in light of you being a grandfather yourself?
Well, thank you. Well, thank you, and we grandfathers have got to stick together and make sure that we leave the planet a safe one for our grandchildren and great-grandchildren, which I hope we both live to see. Look, the answer is this, that we do have to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. The world does, but we also have to ensure that we have affordable and reliable energy. We have to make sure that we keep the lights on and we can afford to keep the lights on. Energy policy has to be driven by engineering and economics, not by ideology and, as we've seen, for example, in South Australia, sheer idiocy, you know, where you had an enormous investment in wind power. Nothing wrong with that, except they didn't have anything to keep the lights on when the windmills stopped turning. A catastrophe. So you've got to plan it right. There will be a role for fossil fuels for a long time. How long, who knows? But the fact of the matter is there will be, but you've got to make sure that you achieve those three objectives: affordability, reliability, and that you reduce your emissions. Now, the National Energy Guarantee, which is the energy policy that we are supporting, which was proposed to us by the Energy Security Board and which is getting growing support around the nation, is one that will enable those three objectives to be met together. And in terms of renewables, my government is supporting the construction of the largest single renewable project in our history since the Snowy Mountains scheme was built, Snowy Hydro 2.0. It is a gigantic battery, the biggest battery in the Southern Hemisphere. Now, that will make renewables reliable. So the proposition that I or my government is against renewables is laughable. What we're doing is ensuring that we have the backup to make renewables reliable, because otherwise you've got no power when the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing.
All right, we have time for one last question, and it's from Diana Bonvini.
Hi, just on the note about energy, there's often a lot of talk about solar and wind energy, but nothing is ever said about tidal wave energy. There's no comment, there's no address by you on that level.
Okay,
we are surrounded by...
We might take that as a comment.
Just very quickly...
We are very much against time, Prime Minister. I want to get to the question.
We are paying attention to it, but Diana, I'd say that there is... it is very site-specific so far. We have put government money into supporting wave energy technology, especially in Western Australia, but it is nowhere near the same stage of development as a variable renewable like solar and wind.
OK.
That's not enough.
Sorry, we'll just leave it there. We're going to our last question now. It comes from Jean Burke.
Work-life balance is an issue for working Australians. Many of us are working unpaid overtime. And I believe you're in the same boat, maybe the same yacht. I haven't asked my question yet. I wanted to ask how you manage work-life balance and still have some fun.
Well, I spend as much time as I can with Lucy. I think the secret to a long and happy marriage is to invest lots of time and love into it. And that is so... We even in both of us have very hectic jobs and we're often apart, but we really focus on spending as much time together as we can, and, of course, with our children and grandchildren. Of course, when I went into politics at the ripe old age of 50, our children were growing up. Politics is very tough, federal politics, because you're away so much, is particularly tough on people with members and senators with small children. Really, it's very hard, both on their spouse and, of course, on their kids. So I think it's important in the political domain, and this applies to so many other jobs. The Defence Force is a good example. People in many important jobs like that cannot do them without the love and support and often forbearance of their families.
And also spending a bit of time with the Q&A audience as well, whenever you can.
That's always good.
Absolutely.
And you asked about the leather jacket. Now, I'll tell you what, the leather jacket will be back, but it will be back in winter. I felt that if I wore it in summer, I might melt. And that
well, some of us managed to do OK. So.
Well, yeah. Well, let's start. Well, so you've got leather on. Well, I guess the air conditioning is... The air conditioning is cranked up to the max here. It hasn't always been the case.
And we're all doing fine. That's all we have time for tonight. Please thank our very special guest this evening, Malcolm Turnbull, our Prime Minister. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now remember, you can continue the discussion on Q&A Extra. That's with Tracy Holmes and journalist Paddy Manning. Next week, I'll be presenting Q&A live from Melbourne for our last show of 2017. So we'll look back over a huge year and consider the wash-up of the Bennelong by-election as well. On that panel will be the Minister for Health, Greg Hunt, the Shadow Minister for Infrastructure, Anthony Albanese, the former member for Bennelong, Maxine McHugh, BuzzFeed politics reporter Alice Workman, and the Foreign Affairs editor of The Australian, Greg Sheridan. It's our big end-of-year Q&A spectacular at 9 p.m. next Monday, so I'll see you then. Good night.
Very good.